Cost of ownership. Cost of ownership is a very interesting and often forgotten topic in the software industry or software engineering. It's interesting because it is almost in direct opposition or in balancing with another cost, which we hear a lot nowadays, and it's a cost of change. So when we're talking about that high-level term and very complicated sentence like cost of ownership, we need to clarify what kind of ownership and what kind of cost we're talking about. So for the rest of the talk, when I'm talking about ownership, I don't mean any economical term. I'm actually meaning taking responsibility over the change of the code, right? When taking an ownership of the code means you're taking responsibility to change or maintain the change in the code base. Cost of this responsibility might mean a lot of things, but for the purpose of this talk, I will keep it simple. And in the terms of this talk, I will just talk about cost of maintaining code, basically refactoring it, and writing tests for the code. So testing and refactoring has associated cost, and that's exactly the cost that I'm talking about. And that's a cost that you need to pay to own the code, right? So let me show how it goes with cost of ownership and cost of change and how they differ. So you usually have a system with multiple modules. And over time, you start adding more and more features to different modules in the system. And some of those modules get more and more features. And after a couple of iterations or even months, you start recognizing the pattern where the more changes you add to that particular module, the more it costs. That is called a cost of change. So the cost of change is almost an exponential function, where the more you change the code, the more it costs over time. So if that is the cost of change, then what is the cost of ownership? Well, cost of ownership is a cost that you need to pay over time on a constant basis for particular modules. It is much lower than the overall or high-level cost of change after half of a year of the existence of the module, but is a non-zero value, right? So cost of ownership is essentially a linear value that you pay over time. And essentially, it is stable for a particular module, but the more modules you have in the system and the more modules you own, the more you pay for owning them, right? So essentially what cost of ownership means is that you're taking responsibility or you're taking ownership over one of the modules in the system and you're saying, okay, over time, I'm willing to pay cost of refactoring and testing that module, and I'm not willing to pay and refactor and maintain modules that I don't own. So why is it important? It becomes very important because paying cost of ownership essentially changes the function of cost of change. So when you combine these two, what happens is you are paying constant, stable cost of ownership over the modules that you do own. And because of that, every time you want to introduce a change in the modules that you do own, the cost of change actually goes like this. So it becomes capped by the cost of ownership you have in the system. So cost of ownership essentially is a balancing mechanism and the way you keep control over your cost of change. Now, the interesting concept here is that cost of ownership is a stable, ongoing cost that you need to pay throughout the entire lifetime of the project or the code base, which means the more modules in the system you own, the more you need to pay. So the trick here is basically to pay or own as less modules as possible. And at the same time, owning means paying. So if you're building a system, how can you own only small parts of it and not the others? Well, the solution is, in the Greenfield project, is you outsource third-party modules, either to another team in your company or maybe to the vendor, to some third-party libraries or the frameworks, right? Or the third-party team in your organization. You basically use commodity features. How does it relate to the legacy code? Well, essentially, the formula is very the same. What happens in the legacy code is you usually, when you find it, you have a couple of really, really big modules in it. And the mistake that a lot of teams do is they say, okay, now I need to pay cost of ownership over this entire system with 2 modules. Whereas in reality, what they need to do is they need to recognize that the change will not happen in the entire system, in every single line of it. Change will happen only in a small fraction of that system. So what they need to do is they need to separate these big modules into smaller pieces and take ownership over some of those modules, but outsource all the rest. And that is essentially how you keep a tab on the cost of change in the legacy system without the need to rewrite. You're starting to pay cost of ownership over the modules that you do plan to change on an ongoing basis, but only in these modules. And you basically either outsource or do not touch already written modules that you don't plan to change. They are there, isolate them, and keep them be.